Hilchos Shvisas Yomtiv Perek Shlishi, the laws of resting on holidays, chapter 3. Today, the main topics are going to concern the laws of slaughtering an animal and preparing its meat on holidays, as well as baking on holidays, the different laws that govern that, all within the general context which we saw in chapter 1 of these laws, that all labor is forbidden on holidays besides for melechet ochel nefesh, besides for labor that has to do with preparing food. So long as it meets a bunch of conditions, it has to be for that day, something that you couldn't do before the holiday, it has to be for a Jew, and it has to be for food. As long as it meets those conditions, you're allowed to do it on Shabbos. And so we learn about preparing meat and baking, also straining at the end of the chapter, and other things, all related to the idea of allowing us to make food on the holidays. And interestingly, we pick up in the beginning of the chapter on something that we actually closed yesterday's chapter with. And you find this a lot in the Rambam, where the final law of one chapter will literally segue into the first law of the next chapter. Yesterday we were closing the topic of muktzeh, the idea that everything you use for food on a holiday has to be mukhan. It has to be prepared to be used for food before the holiday. Things that are muktzeh, things that are typically set aside, humans will put them away without intending to use them for food necessities on holidays, may not be used, in fact, on the holidays. And so the final example the Rambam dealt with yesterday was afar, using dirt. If somebody were to bring a pile of dirt into his home before the holiday, if he puts it in a corner, designating a place for it, that makes it no longer muktzeh, rather mukhan. Now it's prepared, ready, and he can then make use of it the next day. And the Rambam opens this chapter with a very practical use one might make with that dirt, actually very related to the times that we're in right now, the days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, in which each of us is going to fulfill the custom of kaparot, where we take a chicken, wave it over our head, then we slaughter it, and give the money to the poor. One of the unique mitzvahs that we get to do when we do kaparot is the mitzvah of kisui hadam, covering the blood. The Torah tells us that there are a couple of types of livestock, of animals, of living beings. There's a behema. Behema is an undomesticated animal. A domesticated animal, like an ox, sheep, goat, cows, those types of things are behemot. Then we have what's called a chaya, which is an undomesticated animal, like a deer, for example. And then we have of. We have birds. Chickens are the most common, of course, but any other bird as well goes into that category. And the Torah tells us that when we slaughter a behema, when we slaughter a regular animal, you just slaughter it and boom, you go and take the meat, prepare it to eat. When you slaughter a chaya, an undomesticated animal, or an of, or a bird, there's a special mitzvah called kisui hadam, that once you slaughter it, and the blood which carries the lifeblood, comes out of the animal, one should cover that blood be'afar, with dirt. And we get to do that by kaparot, but in fact, we should do it anytime. It's not so common nowadays because we don't all slaughter our own animals we buy from the store. But if you were to slaughter your own animal or your own bird, assuming it goes into the category of chaya or of, it has to be covered. So the Rambam says, here's a practical use you might make with your dirt if it wasn't muktzeh, if it was mukhan. Says the Rambam halacha aleph, misha hayale afar mukhan efer mukhan. Somebody has dirt that's considered prepared, it's not muktzeh. Or ash that's considered prepared, it's not muktzeh. Shemuter letaltaloi, in which case it's allowed to be moved. Hareza sheichet chayav v'oif u'mechas adamam. So now you're able to go to your backyard and slaughter any of your undomesticated animals or birds and cover their blood, as the mitzvah is. But if you were not to have any dirt that could be moved, or any ash that could be moved, then in fact, hareza lo yishchat, because that's such an important mitzvah, that when you slaughter a chaya or an of, you have to cover the blood. If you don't have any accessible dirt to use for that mitzvah, that also precludes you from slaughtering those animals or birds. Hareza lo yishchat. Initially, you should not slaughter those types of animals or birds. V'im avar v'shachat, if you transgressed and you did slaughter that animal, and now you have the blood sitting in front of you, but no dirt with which to cover it, lo yechas adamam ad la'erev. You must push it off. You cannot cover their blood until the evening, till after the holiday is over. The Chain, and the Rambam says now something even more. Similarly, Beria, you have a creature, shehu safek im chayahi im behema. There was one type of animal, one species of animal, called in the Mishnah and the Talmud the koi, and the sages were unsure whether it goes into the category of behema or it goes into the category of chaya, whether it's domesticated or undomesticated animals. One of the practical ramifications would be for this mitzvah of kisui hadam. So let's say you were raising such an animal in your backyard. You would think, perhaps, what's the problem if I slaughter it? Maximum, I'll cover its blood. Just in case it's a chaya, I'll cover its blood. Says the Rambam, Ein sheichat inaisa b'yamtiv. You actually should avoid, you should not slaughter it on the holiday. V'im shachat, and even if you did slaughter it, lo yechasa dama ad la'erev, do not cover its blood till evening. Afilu haya le'afar muchan ha'yefer, even if you did have ready to go dust, dirt, or ash. Why? What's the problem? Maximum, like I said before, just in case it's a chaya, I'll cover it. What could possibly go wrong? Well, the answer is, there's another very practical ramification of difference whether an animal is in the category of a behema or of a chaya. And that is as it relates to the idea of chelev. There are certain forbidden fats that are forbidden to eat by a Jewish person so long as they're in a behema, in a domesticated animal. In a chaya, in an undomesticated animal, those very same fats are permitted. So while you might think that you're just doing an extra mitzvah, covering the blood of this doubtful animal, behema or chaya, and you're saying, what's the worst that can come of it? I'm just covering the blood. Somebody watching you might think, hey, if you're covering the blood on a holiday, you must know that the animal in front of you is a chaya. You must know it's an undomesticated animal which must have its blood covered. If it's an undomesticated animal, that also leads me to say the leniency that relates to the undomesticated animal, i.e. that the chelev, the fats of this animal, are permitted. That could be a big no-no, a big boo-boo, a big stumbling block, as we call it, a michshol. Somebody might be led to think that the fats of this animal are permitted. Shema Yemar Harayas, in the words of the Rambam. Perhaps somebody watching you might say, Chayav Adoyis, this must be certainly an undomesticated animal. That's why I'm watching this guy slaughtering and covering the blood of this animal on the holiday. And the person that's watching will then come to permit its forbidden fats to be eaten when we're not sure. We're actually in doubt. If it is a chaya, that's true, the fats are permitted, but in case it's a behema, we have to avoid eating those fats. As in fact, the Rambam rules when he talks about the laws of the koi later on, he will tell us that out of doubt, we go with all the stringencies, including not eating the fats. So that's the first law as it relates to covering the blood when you slaughter an animal on the holiday. Halacha beis. Similarly, if somebody slaughters an undomesticated animal or a bird before the holiday, their blood requires covering, but you didn't have a chance to cover it before the holiday, lo yechasa damam b'yamtiv. Do not cover the blood on the holiday. And why is that? Because it's not a labor that's for food purposes, and you could have done it yesterday. What happens if you had an interesting case happen to you? You wanted to make a massive meal on the holiday, and so you slaughtered all different types of animals. You slaughtered a behema, let's say a sheep. You also slaughtered a chaya, a deer, and a bird. Now, v'nis arev damam, their bloods got mixed up. Only the bloods of the undomesticated animal and the bird are liable to be, or have to be covered. The blood of the behema does not have to be covered. If you're going to go ahead and cover it, you're doing something extra on the holiday that you shouldn't do. Says the Rambam, therefore, lo yechaso yisad la'erev, you cannot cover this blood mixture till the evening, with one exception. If you had ready to go dirt or ash, and with one shovelful you can cover all the blood, well then you're not doing anything extra. You're covering all the blood in one go. Then sure, go ahead and cover it. Do the mitzvah of kisui hadam as it applies to the blood of the undomesticated animal and the bird. And even though together with that, the blood of the behema is getting covered, since it's all being done in one shot, you're good. Halacha gimel. Hashoichet behema b'yamtiv. Another law that relates to slaughtering an animal on the holiday. And this we're going to develop much further in the 5th book of the Rambam, where the Rambam will tell us that there are 5 laws that are halacha l'Moshe miSinai, 5 things that you have to be very careful with by tradition from Moses when you slaughter an animal. And one of them is that the knife must always be visible. It cannot get hidden under a cover or under, let's say, the hair of an animal. So what would happen is, many slaughterers had the custom that when they slaughtered a sheep, for example, which had lots of wool, as you can see here in the picture, what they would do is before they would bring the knife to the neck, they would pull out some of the wool in the place of the neck so that their knife would never be completely hidden under the wool. What about on the holiday? Can you do this? It says the Rambam, if somebody slaughters an animal on holiday, it is permitted for him to uproot, to pick out some of the wool in the place of the knife with his hand, provided that you do not move the hair away from its place. You don't get to pick it out and put it on the side. Leave it there mixed in to the rest of the wool of the neck. Do not take it away. But if you're doing something similar for a bird, you're worried your knife is very small and it might get hidden in the feathers of the bird, lo yimrait. There you cannot pull out the feathers by hand, because that's actually normal. pulling out wool from an animal's neck is not so normal. It's only being done for the purpose of the mitzvah. Pulling out feathers by hand from a bird is common practice. The nimtza toilish b'yamtiv, and then so you're actually just literally picking. You're doing the labor of picking on holiday, not for a food purpose, not allowed. Halacha dalet. After you slaughter an animal, on the way to preparing the meat, what's the next stage typically? Skinning the animal. Hamafshit er behema b'yamtiv. Somebody who skins the hide of an animal on holiday, lo yimlachenu. You should not then go ahead and salt it. We saw in the laws of Shabbat that one of the close derivatives to the 39 primary categories of labor is salting skins, because salting skins was one of the important steps in the tanning process. On Shabbos, here you are slaughtering an animal. That's allowed because you're doing it for food purposes. So you say, you know what? Once I'm on the job, let me also go ahead and pour some salt on the skins. That's not food necessities. You can't do that. Shezeh ibudhu. That's under the literal milacha, primary labor of tanning. You're doing work not for the needs of food preparation. What you can do though is the Torah understands that you're worried about your hide. If you leave your hide unprocessed for extended period of time, it can get ruined. So what you can do right away with your hide is put it in a place where many people walk. So people will step on it, and that way it won't get ruined. Because the stepping will also do somewhat of the effect that the salt might have had, not on the highest level, but in some way, and therefore that's allowed. The only reason the sages allowed this is because they want you to experience joy on the holiday, so you don't hold yourself back from slaughtering. If you know you can't do anything with your hide, you're going to say, you know what, forget the whole thing, I'm not going to slaughter an animal b'chalal. Slaughter the animal, said the sages, and we'll give you some permission to do a little maneuver with the hide, put it in front of where people will step. Another way you can get around this, says the Rambam, we're going to learn later, also in the 5th book of the Rambam, part of the laws of koshering, that before you consume meat, you must salt it, whether you're going to cook it or you're going to roast it. If you're going to roast it, it doesn't require as much salt. If you're going to cook it, it requires a lot of salt. Says the Rambam, here's what you can do. You're going to roast your meat, the meat of the animal. Take the meat and salt it in preparation for the roasting over this hide. So you get 2 birds with 1 stone. You get to salt your meat, and the salt will then benefit the hide. You can salt meat for roasting process on top of this hide, and you can purposely make a trick concerning this matter. What does that mean, a trick? Ketzad, how does that look like? Salt a little flesh here, a little meat there, move the meat around on the hide so you get to salt multiple parts of the hide, till it turns out that you salted the entire hide just by virtue of the fact that you're salting meat for roasting, and you're salting as a secondary byproduct the hide as well. However, says the Rambam, when do we say that you're allowed to do this trick salting? If you're salting the meat to be roasted. As I mentioned before, when you salt meat for roasting, it doesn't require so much salt. But if you're going to salt meat to be used in cooking in a pot, you cannot do that salting over the skin. That's pretty obvious. You put a ton of salt, and you're also going to pour a little more, end up salting the hide purposely, and that's not allowed. Similarly, you cannot salt fats, forbidden fats, neither can you overturn them in part of their preparation process, nor can you spread them out in the wind over pegs, because the forbidden fats are forbidden, they cannot be eaten. And so any work you do with them is work not for food preparation, not allowed on the holiday. Halacha vav, when you actually skin the animal, lo yargil b'yamtiv. You should not do the process that's called yargil. Yargil means skinning by the foot, as the Rambam describes it. Ketzad hu amargil. What is considered skinning by the foot? Zeh hamoitzi kol basar meregel achas. They had a technique whereby they can make a slit in where the animal's foot, the animal's leg, and get all the meat out through that leg, such that the entire hide is preserved complete and it cannot and it wouldn't be torn. They can make types of flasks from that. It was very impressive technique, which you can do. On holiday, you don't do that. Skin it regularly, cut the whole thing, it's no problem. Because to do that type of skinning will be a lot of extra bother. We allow you to do labor on Yom Tov, but not extra labor. There is no need for the holiday. The holiday doesn't require such extraneous effort. You also cannot make a handle on your meat. Try finding a picture of a guy holding a massive piece of meat. When you have these big pieces of meat, sometimes it would require making a handle to hold it. And so the handle could be made in two ways, as the commentaries explain it. Either by carving into the piece of meat, such that you can kind of put your hand into it and that becomes the handle. Like you have today on some water bottles, they have an indent and the indent becomes the handle. Or actually carving out an actual handle, a piece of meat that kind of sticks out and you're able to hold on to it to grasp it in that way. That cannot be done on the holiday. It's unnecessary. If you're doing it with a knife, that's when it's forbidden. So you don't end up doing things the way you do it on the weekday and you turn a holiday into the weekday. What you are allowed to do though is to make a mark onto a piece of meat. You want this brisket, you don't want that one, you want this cut, you don't want that cut. Those types of mini marks, those are allowed to be made on the holiday. You can, I guess the word is kind of scorching or boil. They would take the heads of animals or chickens and the feet, and to remove all the hair, they would dip it into boiling hot water. That's moilgin. And it was supposed to help in the hair removal process. You can do that on holiday. You can also torch it, singe it. You run the hide over a fire very quickly and all the hair comes off. But other hair removal techniques may not be used on holidays. You cannot layer the hides with lime, or with a kind of clay, or with earth. Those are more professional, high-level techniques. You don't need them on the holiday. Nor can you cut the hairs off with a scissor. Talking about scissors, you cannot trim vegetable leaves with their scissors that are meant for them. But if you have types of food or fruits that have little thorns sticking out of them, different cacti or different sabras as we have even today, you could go in kundas va'akaviyas. The Rambam gives some examples of vegetables and fruits called kundas and akaviyas. I'm not sure the exact English identification for that. But those things you actually could cut down b'tispeidas, even with a proper scissor, because that's literally food preparation. You're preparing the food to be eaten. A human being can't hold this fruit with all those pokey thorns coming out of it. So preparing it is allowed in that way. Now that's all preparing animals, preparing meat. Now we move on to baking bread and other types of baking. Halacha ches. Mutar lolush isa gedola b'yamtiv. It's permitted to knead a large dough on the holiday. We're going to see a number of times throughout these halachot that making big quantities of stuff on holiday is not usually recommended because it looks like you're also preparing for the weekday. But when it comes to dough, the sages said you're allowed you're allowed to knead a big dough on holiday. Some commentaries link it to what we saw in chapter 1 where a woman can fill up a whole pot of meat because the meat cooks better when there's a lot of meat. Also with the dough, the bigger the dough, the more the whole dough gets processed better. The halosh isa me'erev yamtiv. If you've kneaded a dough before the holiday, einay mafrish mimeno chala b'yamtiv. You may not separate the challah on holiday. We know that whenever you make a dough, if it meets the size requirements, you must take a piece of the dough and give it to the Kohen. It's one of the gifts, the Kohanic priestly gifts. If you made a dough before the holiday, you do not take the challah on the holiday. It's something that you can do before the holiday. It's not a labor that's required, and so you don't take it on holiday. But if you only needed the dough on the holiday, mafrish mimeno challah v'neis l'kayin, then of course, take the challah, give it to the Kohen. What if the dough was ritually impure? Or after you separated the dough for challah, the challah became impure. So now we have to know a law that the Rambam is going to tell us later in the 7th book when he discusses the laws of challah. And that is that in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel, in the times when challah was separated biblically, if you have ritually impure dough or ritually impure challah, it was not given to the Kohen. It was burnt. So the Rambam says, since you're dealing over here, knowing that, since you're dealing with impure dough, lo yevashal esachala, you may not cook this dough, she'ein mevashlin b'yamtiv elo lechel, because you can only cook on holiday to be eaten. This challah v'zul isreifa emedes, this challah is meant to be burnt since it's ritually impure. But on the other hand, you might say, maybe it's okay, so I'll burn it. Can't burn it either. If you don't burn it on holiday either, because when sacrificial meat or rich or holy things like this dough, challah dough, becomes impure on holidays, we don't burn it on holidays, even if it has to be burnt. Why is this? It's a basic principle in halacha. What is the reason why we're going to go ahead and light the fire and burn the sacrificial meat or dough, in this case, on the holiday? Because there's a biblical commandment to do that. Certain doughs, when they become ritually impure, you have to burn it. Mitzvah saseh. Shenemar, as it says, bo'esh yisaref, you must burn it in fire. However, what's stopping you from making a fire on holiday? The mitzvah against doing work on a holiday. This asiyas malacha she'eno letzerech achila v'chayetze behen, doing labor that's not for the needs of food or anything like it, aseh v'lo aseh, is governed in the Torah by both a positive and a negative commandment. As we saw in the beginning of these halachot, every holiday has a positive and negative mitzvah. Rest, don't do work. We have a principle that when you have one positive commandment against a positive and a negative, the positive doesn't override the positive and the negative. And so here, what's getting you to burn the challah is one positive commandment. What's stopping you from burning the challah is positive and negative, so you can't cook the challah and you also can't burn it. Halacha test, ketzad yaseba. What should you indeed do with this dough? Yanichena the erev, leave it to the evening, the yisreif I saw, and burn it. That would be easy on most holidays. What about Pesach? If it was the holiday of Pesach, Passover, if you're going to leave this dough to rise, it's going to become leaven and going to become chametz, and that's a massive problem. The way to get out of that is, don't take the challah in the normal way. Typically, we take challah for the kohen from the raw dough, and only then, after separating the challah, do we bake the rest of the dough. Here, wait. Make the dough into bread, bake the bread, don't separate the challah as dough, bake the entire impure dough, and then, as is typically allowed after the fact, here we're doing it initially, separate the challah from the ready-made bread. And of course, if you leave that bread to the evening and only then burn it, it's not going to become chametz, because once bread is already made, it can't become further chametz. Of course, when we're talking about bread, we mean bread that's kosher for Passover, so matzah. Halacha yud. Other laws of baking. Ein oifin bepurni chadasha. You may not bake in a wide, new oven. For fear that, these clay earthenware vessels, sometimes if they weren't used properly, the first time round they could explode. And you're going to ruin the bread that's in there. And that'll stop you from joy of the holiday. Therefore, the rabbi said, you have a new oven, don't use it on the holiday first time, use an old oven. We also may not scrape out the ash from an oven or a stove. All you must do is layer it down. You can push down the layers of ash that have accumulated if they do, as in this picture. You can do that. But if the amount of ash is stopping you from roasting or cooking, you must scrape out the ash, then mutter, then of course it's allowed, because then it becomes a malacha that's being done for food purposes. We may also seal off the mouth of an oven with mud that has been collected from around the riverbank. That's provided that you softened it the day before the holiday. But to knead mud, kind of make a mortar, on the holiday, asur, that's forbidden. However, you can do it if you're using ash as your base, at least then by piatanor, to seal off the mouth of the oven, as we saw in the laws of Shabbat. Halachically, you can never knead ash into a proper mass. So whatever you're going to mix it with is not going to really create a proper mortar, and therefore you can use whatever paste you make out of that to seal your oven on the holiday. Yud Aleph, Tanor v'kirayim chadashim, a new oven or a new stove. Ein sachin oisan b'shemen b'yamtiv. We may not smear them with oil on a holiday. Ve'ein tashin oisan b'matlis, nor smooth them down with a cloth. Ve'ein mefigin oisan b'tzoinin kedei lechasma, nor cool them down with cold water to harden them. Ve'im b'shvil lefles b'hen, but if you're doing the cold water to allow for the next round of baking, mutter, that's allowed, because you're doing it for food purposes, not just to harden the material. Ein melabanin es ha'avanim. We may not heat up stones to the point of being red hot. And some texts over here have hare'afim, shingles. Roof shingles were actually used in baking process. They would heat them up to red hot and then roast meat on them. Litzlois elefes alein, to roast or to bake over them. We may not heat these up to a red hot point on the holiday, because it also hardens the actual material of the shingle or of the stone, which is not a melacha for food preparation, and it's not allowed. We may heat up and bake in a regular wide oven if it's old, not new. And we may heat up hot water in a very big pot. Again, I mentioned before, sometimes we don't recommend making big quantities because it looks like you're saving for after the holiday. In these cases, it's allowed to bake in this wide oven or to heat up hot water in this big pot. Halacha Yud Beis. Ein oisim gevina b'yamtiv. We may not make cheese on holiday. Even though it's a food preparation milacha, but if it's something that you didn't have to do today, you can do it before. If you were to make the cheese the day before the holiday, nothing would be lost from the taste. But you may crush spices normally, because if you would crush them the day before, they would lose their taste, their strong taste. But salt doesn't require to be done fresh on the day, doesn't have to be, and it therefore should not be crushed on holiday, unless you make some kind of change, abnormal activity. Bend over the mortar, or crush it onto a plate, a wide plate, not the regular mortar and pestle, so you do some kind of shinui, some type of change. What's the underlying reason? Because if you were to grind the salt the day before, it wouldn't lose any of its taste. Similarly, peppercorn should not be ground in its regular grinder, grind it in a regular mortar as you would any other spice. Grits should not be ground in a big grinder, but you may grind it in a small grinder. That would qualify as an abnormal change for these grits. If you're in Israel, or even in a small grinder, it's forbidden. You have to do it the day before. Because the grain, produce in Israel is very good. And there is no loss. Grinding it the day before doesn't lose any of its quality. Therefore, you cannot grind it at all on the holiday. Yudalad hakemach, flour. Even though you already sifted it once very well and removed all the bran from it, and you would think, therefore, what's wrong with sifting it again on the holiday? I'm just sifting sifted flour. Says the Rambam, you may not sift it a second time on the holiday, unless you know that it got dirty again. Maybe a pebble or a wood chip fell inside it. If you saw that happen, now you can sift it again. But if you made some kind of abnormal change, mutar, then it's always allowed. Like let's say you use the back of the sifter, or as in this picture, you sift onto the table instead of onto a bowl or onto a plate. Anything similar of that kind of change. We may crush chaff from the kernels with our fingers. We had this in the laws of Shabbat. Here you go. You hold this, the mixture in your fingers. You go like this, and your fingers will hold the kernels, all the chaff falls away. You can do that on holiday. We may also forcefully remove legumes from their pods on holiday. It's also a similar technique. You'd put a bunch of, let's say, peas, right? Peas in a pod, put them onto a little sack, rub the sack back and forth, and it would force the kernels or the peas out of the pods. You can do that on a holiday. You can also blow from hand to hand with all your strength, separate chaff from kernels that way, and then eat the kernels. You can even use some higher level vessels. A konain, as the commentaries explain, had a very wide top, and it would kind of close into a narrow straw, similar to a funnel, and in which you would pour a bunch of stuff into the top, shake it around, and the kernels would fall through while the chaff would stay on top. Tamcha is a similar mechanism. It's a wider bowl. Also ends up with a little lip, which would collect the kernels and all the chaff would come out. You can use those on holiday. But you may not use regular proper sifters or sieves. Similarly, if you're sorting legumes on the holiday, you may sort it normally. Normally means picking out the bad from the good. You'd pick out the chaff and leave the good stuff that you wanted to leave. And you can do so in your lap or in a bowl, but not using the regular sifters or sieves or wide sorting boards. When do we say that you can pick the bad out from the good, as is the normal custom? If there's more good stuff, good material, than bad material. But if the bad material was more than the good material, you must pick out the good stuff and leave the bad stuff, because it's less bother. And whenever you do labor, even for food preparation on holiday, you always look for what's less bother. And therefore the Rambam says, even in the first case, if there's more work to pick the bad from the good than to pick the good from the bad, even if the good stuff is more, we allow you to pick out the good because it's less work and leave just the bad stuff. There was a type of strainer they would use for mustard seed to strain it out, where all the dirtier or murkier mustard would go out and it would leave the clean mustard on top. You cannot do the regular mustard straining process on the holiday. It seems like you're actually sorting, and there's no actual need for food preparation because you could eat the whole mustard if you wanted. What you could do is pour an egg into the mustard strainer, and it'll help all the murky stuff go out on its own, where you're not actually straining it. Additionally, if the strainer net was already hanging over whatever bowl you're hanging it over, you can even pour wine into it on the holiday because the strainer was already set up. There's no extra work involved. But you cannot hang the strainer net to begin with initially on a holiday. so you don't do things the way you do it during the weekday. What you could do though is make a trick. Where you would spread out the net of the strainer, having in mind to use it to store pomegranates, let's say, which don't get strained obviously. And then you actually put in some pomegranates there, and then you can take out the pomegranates, and you have now a standing net. You say, hey, the net's already standing, I'll pour in my sediment and I'll strain my wine as I would normally do.